design. And now what they're saying, and through the award of this book, is that now we have a rigorous way to think about how to critically think about design issues at each stage and phase of the research process in qualitative research. So from my standpoint, of course, I think this is huge, and I think this is great, and I think this is groundbreaking. I don't know. This is exactly, well, you didn't ask. I could go on, Anne. I'll stop.
No, but it's interesting because you said the book was written to maybe address some of the issues with research design. Now, maybe you can expound a bit on that. What has been some of the design challenges, qualitative research design challenges that you found that you said, okay, let me capture in this book?
Well, this book has been in my brain for literally decades. My discipline is psychology. When I got out of graduate school in psychology, I knew a lot about survey research design and experimental research. I knew nothing about qualitative research and qualitative research design. And I knew that what I wanted to do the rest of my career was to be a researcher. But to be a researcher means what? To me, it meant knowing all of those aspects of quality survey research design. But what about qualitative research? It always seemed to go not be discussed. And I would say that is something that has changed very much for the better over the years. So what has been in my brain for a long time, and finally came out in this book, is why aren't we thinking at each phase of the research process, let's say data collection, why aren't we thinking about how valid the outcomes are of our research based on our data collection methods? Why aren't we thinking about more critically about the interview and moderator guide, for instance, and having that discussion among ourselves as researchers? Why aren't we thinking more critically about researcher effects in qualitative research and the bias and inconsistencies that researchers bring to the process? Why aren't we thinking more critically and having a discussion among ourselves about participant effects and their willingness and ability to provide us with the information that we ask of them? So I don't know if that answered your question, Anne, but that's kind of what's been in my brain for all of this years that finally came out in this book, and is really enabling researchers to think critically about these design issues and being able to have a conversation about them, to ultimately improve the quality of their research, which is ultimately what? So the fourth component of the TQF, the total quality framework, is usefulness. So you have credibility, you have data collection credibility, you have analyzability, analysis. Right, thank you. Yeah, and the third component is transparency, which is the reporting function, and how transparent we are in what we did, and our audit trail, and the transferability of our research. And all of which, as you see from the schematic, all of that leading into the fourth component, which is usefulness, which is basically what? It's like, well, so what? So what? We went through this exercise and we did this research and we followed all of these critical thinking skills. But so what? Do we have actionable results? Have we confirmed or denied certain hypotheses we had about whatever it is we're investigating, and things of that nature?
Okay. So you mentioned the total quality framework, which I have on screen. So this is in your book, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And is it fair for me to say it's a rubric? Or is it a framework? How would you term this schematic then, so to speak? Is it like a rubric or something researchers can use to improve the quality of their qualitative research?
It's a framework which was established to enable researchers to help researchers develop critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. So they're getting ready to design a piece of qualitative research, whether it be in-depth interviews or focus groups or observation or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. The framework says, okay, fine, so in your design, you're going to need to be thinking, obviously, about data collection. And so what are the aspects of data collection that you're going to need to think about? And so what we talk about in the book, so that would be under the credibility component of the TQF. And what the book does is it first talks about the TQF, about the framework, about why it exists, and much of what I just mentioned, why it was created, what its purpose is, and what the purpose is of each one of the components. And then the book is basically a methods book, because then the book has a chapter for in-depth interviews, for focus group discussions, for observation, ethnography, for content analysis, for case studies, and in each chapter, in addition to just kind of giving you an overview of the method itself and talking about the method, it then talks about, okay, now this is how you apply the total quality framework to this method. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So, for instance, all of which is to develop critical thinking skills in the design of your research. So, if you're doing in-depth, if you're designing an in-depth interview study, if you look in the book, and the total quality framework would say to you that you need to think, what's one of the things that you're going to think about a lot? Okay, one of the things we think about in all research is sampling and sample size. And boy, if you go to the literature, there's a lot of stuff written about that, mm-hmm. including on my blog. And what we would suggest is that, in addition to the fact that you're going to use a purposeless sampling in qualitative research, that how many interviews you conduct is something that you, the researcher and the designer of those research, is going to need to consider, not only at the design stage, but you will also need to be thinking about it in the field stage. What does that mean? That means that, for instance, and in the book, we give, I want to say, I think it's right, 10 questions that the researcher should be asking themselves as when they're in the field, and to help them determine whether or not they, for instance, maybe need to conduct more interviews than they had originally planned. So, for instance, you're conducting interviews, you're in the field, and for whatever reason, and this happens, of course, for whatever reason, one or more of the interviews are not complete. You are not able to complete that interview, again, for whatever reason. And the researcher needs to go back and think about that. And if those interviews missed critical components of the interview having to do with the key research objective of the research that what you're investigating, may need to rethink that and think, okay, we now need to add additional interviews to our sample design. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So these are all things that are talked about in the book, and that's just one example of the kind of thing the researcher would do in applying the total quality framework.
Okay, all right. Well, you explained it very well in terms of even data collection and how you approach your purposive sampling, because of course it's a qualitative. So this framework is only for qualitative research, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So you do have sampling because it's more purposeful sampling, of course. I have a question because you touched on sampling, but earlier you were speaking of like moderator bias. So I'm this will help me your answer because I am planning a focus group workshop month, and moderator bias. It is something that should be managed for. So how could I apply this framework to focus groups, especially when it comes to, well, the sampling you touched on, but like moderator bias? Would that be part of credibility or analysis?
Yes, because that would be your data collection. The moderator is collecting the data, right? And so yes, so we talk about moderator bias in the book, and how you might mitigate bias in terms of how questions are asked, in terms of how the moderator builds rapport with participants. And this is true, of course, of interviewing as well, in-depth interviews. There's a lot of similarities. I was going to say for in-person groups, but even online groups these days, even how the moderator is dressed. When I train on focus groups, I think some people laugh, but I have carried this with me for decades, I guess now. When I moderate a group, I always wear an open collar. In other words, I don't wear, I know this sounds silly, but I don't wear something close to my neck like this, a turtleneck or something like that. Because why? Because an open collar, I believe, says to the participants, I'm open to hear from you, and of course I do that for interviews too. I'm open to hear and respond and accept whatever it is you have to tell me, if that makes sense. So anyway, so there's all kinds of things in the book about, I don't think we have that in the book. That's kind of just a Margaret thing that I put into my little trainings, but
that's a nice tip for me, Margaret. Do you mind if I borrow it in my
yes, please, in
my training next month, and I'll give you all credit because I know that one about even your attire.
Yeah.
I knew about closed body language, but I didn't know that it makes sense even not to use a turtleneck. I was just thinking, oh, it's cold. So, okay. So thank you. That's a great tip. I see some questions coming in. So this is one. What would be the main difference between qualitative approach, qualitative design, and qualitative methodology? Or is it all the same thing?
Yeah, well, qualitative methodology, I mean, we talk about the various methods and approaches to qualitative research. And what was the question? The difference between that and qualitative design? Yes. That is when we're talking about, now we have selected the method and we are now designing a research within that method. So we have looked at what it is. We have looked at our key research questions and objectives. We have looked at our resources. We have looked at what's available to us in terms of the population segment and the sample. And we have determined that the best method will be focus group discussions, let's say. And now we're in the business of sitting down and saying, okay, now how do we design this focus group study?
Okay.
That makes sense?
So methods and everything else comes before design.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
all
Right.
right. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes.
All right, thank you. I'm going through the list of questions, and here's another from Sarah. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it is, apart from researcher bias, does TQF consider policymaker bias or the bias of governments, organizations, individuals commissioning the evaluation and research?
The bias, basically the bias of your clients. I mean, that's the bias of the people who are asking for the research. Yeah, no, the TQF has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
The TQF stays out of politics. The TQF is simply a tool for the researcher to use to give critical attention to each design element within their research. The data collection, the analysis phase, the reporting, how you're going to report, and all of which is feeding into to the so what phase. Have we done something that's actually useful? So that's all for the researcher. Now, what's going on in terms of the policymakers who are needing or requesting this research? That's a whole nother agenda.
Whole different ballpark, right? You
That's
need
a whole
something.
different ballpark. Yeah, you're on your own with that.
Okay, so what have been some of like the misconceptions of qualitative research that you have come across?
Oh, well, I think that the most obvious and the most prevalent is this. There tends to be an overwhelming need to apply survey research understanding of survey research to qualitative research. Now, some of you may be confused by that comment because I just told you that one of the really, I think, great things about this award that we just received by this book is that it acknowledges survey researchers are acknowledging the importance of rigor and quality in qualitative research, and how we use many of the same principles, the same ideas, in terms of the idea is that all research should abide by certain core principles, but that is different. That is not saying that qualitative research and in quality research design is trying to mimic quantitative or survey research. That may seem somewhat confusing, but it's not. And what the TQF is doing, and it's important, this is important, is that it is providing critical thinking skills to build rigor into your qualitative research designs while maintaining all of the unique attributes of qualitative research. Now, if you go on my blog, you'll see my schematic and discussion. I have several discussions on the 10 unique attributes of qualitative research. We also have them in the book. And that is important. So I'm sorry, Anne, for going off on this, but you asked the question, what is, and the answer is that that I think because many researchers are so comfortable with survey research and how they use data and how they tabulate data and how they think about analyzing survey data, that it is difficult, if not impossible, I think for some, to really transfer that to qualitative research. Yesterday I did a workshop on qualitative data analysis and how different that is from analyzing survey data. And I think that's something that you have to really train on and practice and do to get, because most people, their thinking is is towards a survey approach.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, and it answers nicely a little bit what Linda was asking as well. How would you respond to those who make the comparison by saying that quantitative is objective and unbiased, whereas qualitative is subjective and biased? So just a misconception about qualitative research already, wherein quantitative is more robust because it's objective and unbiased, while qualitative is subjective and biased. So how would you respond to that comparison?
Well, I would respond by saying I would take out the word bias. I think in survey research is more objective in that we're dealing with survey data, regardless of how well or maybe not so well the survey questions were put together and how appropriate the mode was and all of that. But in any case, in the end, you have a bunch of data that you can manipulate and all. And that's pretty objective. You're not really messing with that too much, even with the weighting and all. But with qualitative research, you go in and you know that it's subjective in the sense that it is the researcher who is understanding the context in which so when you get back qualitative data, it's not discrete items. And I think that's the difference, is that we're not dealing with discrete items. We're dealing with very interconnected and contextually based data. You have to not only understand that about qualitative research, you have to embrace it. And as you embrace it and you analyze the data on that basis. Now, when you do that, is that not to say that another researcher could not take the same data and come up with an alternate or different interpretation of that data? I would suggest to you that could happen, but there is this is more than you wanted, Anne, but there is so much that needs to go on. So to be a good analyst of qualitative of data, and one of the skills and one of the aspects that's important is that the person who actually did the interviewing or did the moderating needs to be involved in the analysis. In other words, you don't just do some interviews and do some group discussions, go out, send it out for transcripts, and have someone else code it. Because then what's the point of doing qualitative research, right? So this is a very long and I was going to say incomplete answer to this question about whether it's subjective. It's subjective to the extent that we, as the researchers, are utilizing the data, utilizing as the interviewer or the moderator for that discussion. I am also utilizing my experience with those participants to understand that data and what went on in that data and how it came to be that people said what they said. And from there, I'm drawing my categories, themes, and interpretations. Now, and again, somebody else could come along and come up with something different. Mm-hmm. But I would suggest to you that person would also need to have very carefully studied the recordings of those events, of those interviews and groups, in order to be from the same mindset as I was when I did the analysis. I don't think that is exactly what whoever asked that question, Anne, was going for. But that's the best I can do. So I would take So I think there is objectivity on one side. I think there is some subjectivity on the other side. I don't think that's a bad thing. I would take the word bias out in both cases because I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay.
And that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, and the central theme, the central theme I got, because you touched on important topics. So just to summarize, what I got from it as well is the objective, that part we get, but bias, we can bias is can be in quantitative research as well. So, and what I got to was in terms of the analysis, that for qualitative research, it's best if the person who collected the data also does the analysis, the coding and the theming. It's not like in quantitative research.
Yes, that is the ideal situation.
That's the ideal situation.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So that's the message in quantitative research. You can have data collectors, enumerators, inputting the data, collecting it with the survey instruments, and then after that, it goes to a statistical analysis person. So maybe the data collector doesn't even meet the person analyzing the data, but for qualitative research or methods, it's better if the same person who conducts the focus group or the in-depth interview is the one who analyzes the data.
Well, because what can often happen is, again, a bunch of interviews are conducted, some focus groups are conducted, and the recordings get sent off to someone to transcribe these recordings. And by the way, so one of the things we talk about in the book is how to hire a transcriptionist. What are the qualities of transcriptionist that you should be looking for? Those are the kinds of things we get into when in the TQF. But anyway, and then you get the transcripts back. And so what do you have now? Now you have a bunch of text that you've kind of lost. You have lost the person in the research. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And because I learn, if I have just finished interviewing you, I take away more from you than just what you said in response to a question.
Yeah, it's my tone, my facial expression, my body language.
I take away your enthusiasm, your personality attached to whatever it is we were talking about. So, yeah.
All right. So on the topic of analysis, you spoke about the qualities of the person who transcribes. Is there like software we can use for these things? Do you recommend, because all these voice to text software and voice recognition software that they have and qualitative analysis software, what would you recommend?
Well, there are increasingly a bunch of options out there for that kind of thing. I don't have any to recommend. In my opinion, they're not there yet. They're just, and I've been saying that for a while now, but voice to text is, every time I hear of a new option, a new resource, and I kind of go to check it out, I don't know, I'm not really impressed, but I think that's changing by the minute, maybe, and that if someone's interested, I'd be happy to come up with maybe a list of possible candidates for that kind of option. It's not something that I would ever personally use, but I do try to stay in touch with what is out there. And like I say, the last time I checked, it just was not there yet. So I'm happy.
Your qualitative analysis in general, is it that you just work with, like for the focus group, I understand you have your transcripts. But what if your method was observation, right? Non-participant observation, or your in-depth interviews and so forth? How do you analyze data?
So what you just asked me, how do I analyze data?
Yeah, outside of using then the voice recognition and the transcripts and so forth. Say someone listening now to us would want to hear, okay, what do you think is best in terms of the qualitative data analysis? We know about the coding and the theming, but is it that we're still writing out handwritten notes, posting on the wall with tape and...
Yeah, see, I don't do the post-it note thing. So, and I don't know if you've ever talked in the work you do, Anne, so they may be familiar with CAGDAS, Computer Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis. There's a bunch of like NVivo and Atlas TI and MaxQDA and that kind of thing, which rely heavily on transcripts. So that's definitely one option. What I do, let me and so what you asked is a long conversation. It's longer we can have. Like I said, I just did a long workshop yesterday on this. But let me just say this, and then you can use your imagination from there, I guess. When I complete an interview or a focus group, the first thing I do is I sit down and I have an Excel spreadsheet. It's just a great way for me to visualize. And what does this have? I have an Excel spreadsheet, and the columns across the spreadsheet, the first few columns on the spreadsheet are reserved for participant information, like maybe certain key characteristic information that I need for my research purposes. But then the rest of the spreadsheet, the columns are reserved for the key objectives. Sometimes that comes from the guide. And by the way, the book goes into the whole guide approach that you should be using, the funnel approach. Anyway, so the spreadsheet and columns are for the key research questions or objectives, again, taken probably partially from the guide itself. And then what I do after each interview and each discussion is I go in there and I capture what I, who did the interview and moderated that discussion, took away as it relates to those key objectives, those key areas within the guide. Now, I do that if it's been an in-depth interview. I'm a huge fan of note-taking and interviewing. Just paper and pencil, by the way, note-taking. So I will do this by way of my notes, as well as going back to the recording. But I do it when I'm fresh out of the interview, fresh out of the discussion, and what I took away, what I learned as the researcher about these key objectives. And so I do that for each interview and each discussion. And that is how I begin all of the analyses I do. Excel. That's how I begin.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Margaret. I'm seeing comments coming in. So one question is, external validity is more or less straightforward and measurable in quantitative studies. But in qualitative studies, we cannot go beyond the study context. In your view, Margaret, what is validity in qualitative research and how can it be explained? Thank you, Tara.
Validity is important, and thank you for the question, because it goes back to kind of the essence of what we were trying to do in the book. And again, why I think we received this award is because to talk about validity just in survey research is not right, because validity in qualitative research is equally important, but it's different, right? And it's where we gain validity is in particularly. I'm still looking at Anne's screen here, and I'm looking at the TQF schematic, and I'm looking at credibility, which is the data collection component of the TQF. And that is where we spend a lot of time thinking and designing our research in order to come back with valid outcomes. So you'll see there under data gathering, for instance, the idea of construct validity. In other words, by the way we have designed the data collection phase of our qualitative research, have we obtained a valid measure of the construct we were out to investigate? Wow. Okay, great. So when you're designing the research, that is your focus, and say, how can we design the research, design the data collection, so that that we have a valid measure of the construct that we are measuring. And how do we do that? Well, there's lots of ways to do that. In terms of all the things we've already talked about, in terms of researcher effects, in terms of your sampling, in terms of participant effects, in terms of all those things, in terms of the interviewer moderator guide, in terms of how you ask questions. I've done a whole webinar, by the way, on the why question. Everybody loves to talk about, we do qualitative research to get at the why. Well, we do. And for heaven's sakes, I asked the why question, but I've done a whole webinar and talked a lot about when the why question is just not the right question to ask, and it's actually going to make the responses you receive back from your questions less valid and less inaccurate measure of the constructs and the ideas you're trying to gain from the research. And we don't have time to get into it now. And I've done it. I've discussed this in my blog, and you can see it there. But but in all those ways, that's how we attack validity in qualitative research. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I like when you spoke about the why question that we seem to ask a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Going back to the TQF, I think Naomi had asked if let me see the question here. Does the TQF go into qualitative research ethics as well?
Well, it does. It does talk about that, and particularly with respect to all of the phases, but in terms of data collection and particularly for the method of observation or ethnography, and the ethical considerations that need to be considered. One of the areas we cover in the chapter on ethnography, for instance, is covert observation, overt and covert observation, which opens up a whole can of worms in terms of ethical practices and protecting participants and that kind of thing. So and of course it gets into reporting and to all of it really. So yes, ethical and moral obligations to the participants is very, very important. And we got into this discussion a little bit yesterday in the workshop on analysis when we were talking about de-identifying participants. And because I was talking about what I've just talked to you about today, which is the idea of the researcher staying close, the interviewer and moderator staying close to the analysis process, so they can bring that into the analysis process, and knowing, and knowing being in touch with the personality and personalities that were interviewed and being able to use that in the analysis and all.
Yeah, because that's the whole essence of qualitative research, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But what I said yesterday, but in terms of, so I think that's important to the analysis. But excuse me, I must be talking too much. It's important to the analysis, but then you need to know when to. I'm sorry, I have something in my throat.
Okay.
To de-identify the participants. Sorry, you should shut me up. I'm talking too much.
No, we're getting useful gems.
Yeah, but anyway, so I didn't, but your moral and ethical obligation to the participants is always at the forefront of everything you do, and particularly, I mean, it's true of all research, survey or qualitative research, but but clearly in qualitative research, because you and the participant are like this.
You get much up close and personal.
Yeah, that has to always be at the forefront of your mind.
So to answer the question, yes, it's covered in the book. Definitely. Yes. All right. Yes. So yes. Manoj asked a question that I think is a little bit philosophical, but here we go. So as we all experience, there's a tension between the qualitative and quantitative methods. Some researchers are now arguing for mixed methods to integrate the methods so as to make them complementary to each other. Mm-hmm. However, books on either quantitative methods or qualitative methods seem to prefer methodological monogamy rather than getting the benefits from methodological polygamy. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Is your book by any means, have you tried to relieve this inherent tension? Many times.
That's a great question. And this book doesn't, but this person who asked this question it's kind of spooky because you're kind of reading my mind. I'm a big fan of mixed methods, and that's not a shock, right? Because I consider myself a researcher, and which is both survey and qualitative research. And I've wondered all of my career, why aren't they married, and I never really got that. And so the whole so I'm a big fan of mixed methods research. And this book does not get into that. That was not the focus or purpose of this book. But I totally get what this person is saying, and I agree with that, and I'm on board with that. And it's something that I have been thinking of myself as something that needs to be. It's something I'm thinking about as something to do.
Maybe for the next book, then, Margaret.
Never know.
The next bestseller.
You never know.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. So Richard now asks, in this period of COVID-19, where many activities are done online, can we focus groups online via Zoom, for example? If so, how can we capture the benefits of body languages in a focus group? Like participants' interaction, for example. So Richard, you should definitely attend my focus group workshop, June 7 to 11, right? Yeah. But I allow Margaret to give you the answers here as well. How do you do remote focus group online using Zoom? Is it recommended when you can't see even body language and establish rapport?
I think, I should probably let there you go. June 7th to June 11th, a whole week of learning about doing focus group discussions. It's an online workshop. Are you going to focus on on conducting online group discussions, Van? Are you doing
That's
face?
that's one of the module.
Okay.
So it's 4 modules with the asynchronous components. So participants work on a learning management platform by themselves. Say the Monday, the Tuesday, and Thursday of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are 2 live sessions with me where we go through.
Great.
And one of the session is totally dedicated to conducting remote or online focus groups.
Mm-hmm.
But the bulk of it is regular way with your moderator face to face. But in terms of COVID, I had to have a session in there because
Sure.
of this pandemic.
Sure.
So you can visit my website to get more detail, guys. But Margaret, Richard, I think is there waiting for your answer on how.
Well, so conducting group discussions online, and Anne mentions asynchronous, and I don't know. Okay, so ideally, this is not the answer you want, Richard. Ideally, and what I use is I go to a qualitative, dedicated platform, not Zoom, not GoToMeeting or something of that nature. I use a qualitative, dedicated platform. 2020 iTracks. There's a few of them. Civicom. Because they are, for the obvious reasons, they are really set up by researchers that, and they cater to the needs of qualitative researchers.
So no Zoom. That's what you're saying, Margaret. that
is not what, as a researcher, that is not where I would go to conduct research. Mm-hmm. These other platforms have a great way, great observation rooms for the clients, or just the observers, whoever they happen to be, and in other aspects. They have markup, various markup exercise tools and things of that nature. Now, having said that, there's plenty of folks out there, plenty of researchers doing focus groups, face-to-face focus groups on Zoom. Let me also tell you that, and I don't know if this is of interest to anyone, but let me just mention it as an option if you haven't tried this. Another group discussion technique I've done is asynchronous groups, where I've actually called, bulletin boards, which is kind of a crazy name, but and again, using a qualitative research platform to carry on, typically in my case, a 3-day discussion with a group of people about a particular topic area. And it's something, again, that goes on for about 3 days. I do it within this platform and that kind of thing. So that's asynchronous. For synchronous, if you're not going to go to the qualitative platform route, you want to use Zoom, that's fine. And again, there are researchers out there doing that. As a matter of fact, I just came from a presentation, I think last Friday, where a group of researchers are saying how when the pandemic is kind of easing up and we're getting back a little bit back to normal life, that part of their focus group work will go back to in person, but a bunch of their focus group work is going to stay with Zoom, which they hadn't really explored before the pandemic. But now that they have, they kind of like it. They like, for instance, in terms of interacting with participants, they like the raising of the hand and how that kind of pushes the participant, up the queue. They like that they can still see everybody, but that it's all just much more convenient for everybody who is there. Though I would caution that the kind of consensus among my colleagues has been, in terms of size, number of people within an online group, Zoom or otherwise, is anywhere from 4 to 6. And some have said 3. But I think the point is the smaller the better. Typically, in my in-person groups, I use I conduct groups with 8 to 10, and to be honest, I love it when only 8 show up because it just is more manageable. I really have pretty intense, in-depth conversations with these people in the discussion. So smaller is better for me. And for in-person, I'm already using 8. And again, for Zoom groups, like I said, my colleagues are using 4 to 6, with the lower number being preferable. What else?
So
I need to say about that.
Well, just to summarize for Richard, the takeaways are that if Zoom is the best you have, okay, but even better, you can use a software that is dedicated for this type of purpose, for the reasons Margaret mentioned, where you, yes, sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
Well, it's the providers of qualitative dedicated platforms are giving you more than just the screen and the features. They're also giving you tech support. They're helping you with recruiting, depending on what we're talking about here. They're helping you with recruiting. They'll help you with confirmations. They'll help you, again, with tech support for your participants, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of services that go into it too.
Yes. And likewise, if you go online, the smaller the focus group, the better. 3 to 6, or 6 pushing it. 4 ideally, 3 to 4 participants online. The smaller you can have the focus group online, it's easier, it's better. And there's definitely advantages, as Margaret mentioned, where persons can raise the hand. So maybe it's more participatory. Everyone gets a turn to speak. And so I'm looking now and I see, okay, another call. I'm looking at the time, guys. Are there any burning questions that we have to get in before we wrap up? We have just a few minutes to wrap up. So if there are any burning questions, in the meantime, Margaret, I just want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And for sharing your expertise. And you do have a website. So there's a website where persons can get in touch with Margaret. What's your website again, Margaret?
The website is rollerresearch.com. The blog, which may be more interesting because I cover a lot of the kind of areas we talked about today, and certainly a lot about the TQF, is researchdesignreview.com.
Okay, research. I'm typing it in the chat. Researchdesignreview.com.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it's in the chat. That's where you can go to read more on Margaret's blog, learn more about her services. She's on LinkedIn as well. Oh, Patience sent in a question. I don't know if maybe you can speak about it quickly. What is the ideal key informant interview sample size for a state level qualitative research?
Sample size. Okay. And I know this person wants just a number. And of course, by now you may know that I'm not going to give you a number, and I'm so sorry. But it really depends on, every project's different. So there is no magical number. And I'll tell you, let me just give you just one little example, and it won't take much time. This will just give you a flavor of. So when I conduct, which I did a bunch of interviews with financial managers at public and private universities in the US, I had to figure out, well, how many am I going to complete? I wound up completing 30 interviews. Well, how did I get to that number? I got to that number based on what my client needed from me and from the research at the end. They needed to have some regional representation. So I needed to have interviews spread around the US. They needed interviews with a range with universities and colleges that had a range of different endowment levels. So I had to think about that. They needed a mix of private colleges and universities and public colleges and universities. So all three of those considerations is what I had to think about when I say, okay, and resources. I only have so much time and money, right? Mm-hmm. So I look at my time and money, and I look at these three criteria from the client in terms of the characteristics of the sample that I'm going to put together. And I came up with 30. So okay. I know that isn't answering your question specifically, but I strongly encourage you to think about sample size that way. You're always going to start with time and money, but once you get past that, you need to think about, okay, what is the objective of this research? What is the key research question? And how am I going to answer that? And in this case, I was going to answer that partly by making sure I had a range of colleges and universities, a range of endowments, a range of regions around the country, so I could see any possible differences.
Okay, so in some patients, the number should be determined by your research question and, of course, your resources, time, and money available. So instead of focusing on an absolute number, which today might be 30, but based on your research questions and resources, next week it's 50 and maybe what the client wants. So it's better to be guided by those criteria than an absolute figure. I think that is a great point to end on. Margaret, thank you so very much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Thanks to everyone who joined us. Thanks everyone for your flexibility as we navigate these technological challenges, right? So have a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you happen to be.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for great questions. Bye-bye.